Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom podcast, episode number 66, and we're going to be talking about Psychedelic Jung. It's our Mysterium Conjunctionis part 3. So we're going to what I've been doing here is working through the Mysterium Conjunctionis using Edinger's Mysterium Lectures. This is a great book if you want to tackle the Mysterium Conjunctionis. So this is our third installation of that. And today we kind of want to talk a little bit about some of the psychedelic aspects or influences of Jung, the reluctance Jung had. I mean, Conjunctionis is his last book that he wrote. I believe he's in his 80s. And then I also want to tell sort of a personal story about a professor of mine from uni who kind of went through this, who he's talked about in Brian Murarescu's Immortality Key, and he's got even some material here in Allegro's The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, but and then a little bit of Jacques Lacan. But the idea here is that reluctance, maybe in Jung's time, to bring forward some of this information. And, we talked about Jung and the occult, so occulted Jung, and now it's sort of psychedelic Jung. So let's kind of dive into it a bit. I think we started out, what I wanted to start out with here was in the coincidentia oppositorum, the logical consequences, the relativity of the God concept. So we're talking here about the difference between where God is positioned and where humanity is positioned, let's call it. And I think there's this great, we sort of talked about this a bit. It is the implied Christian image. It's not quite the one you announced in churches, but the same one as the alchemical interest. God the Father, God the origin, divides into two sons, the good son, Christ, and the bad son, the devil. The reconciling fourth is the Holy Ghost, or the kingdom of God. So he sort of starts showing this Basilides. Jung talks about Basilides' third sonship, and he talks about the bridging between heaven and earth, and how the creative word of let there be light plants like a cosmic seed, and then you have the first sonship, refined, pure, attains immediate union with God. The second sonship, grosser, heavier, winged, can fly, but only with the help of wings. And the third sonship, formless, unpurified, intermixed with the undiscriminated seeds of all things, panspermia or matrix of all possibilities. So it's sort of like they're trying to, Basilides is kind of going into the idea of the descent of spirit into the matter, right? And I think that this is kind of where, what's interesting to me here is a lot of what drives that psychedelic experience, right, is there's some kind of master plan, there's something is ingested. And I think this really becomes the point of Murarescu's book, where they start looking at things like Eleusynian Mysteries and the work of Professor Carl Ruck, who was a former professor of mine. And I'll talk a little bit about this story too. But when you start looking at so let's kind of go into Mysterium Conjunctionis a bit more here, where he says, talking about alchemical projection. It cannot have escaped the alchemists that their soul had something to do with man. Thus Dorn says, from the beginning man was sulfur. Sulfur is a destructive fire, enkindled with the invisible sun. And the sun is the sol philosophorum. It is the sought-after and highly praised philosophic gold, indeed the goal of the whole work. In spite of the fact that Dorn regards the sun and its sulfur as a kind of a physiological component of the human body, it's clear that we are dealing with a piece of physiological mythology, a projection. So alchemical projections sketch a picture of certain fundamental psychological facts as they were to reflect in matter. One of those would be sort of like the wise old man, or the illumination of dawn's light. The modern unconscious has little use for sun and the moon as dream symbols, but we turn more to illumination. Sort of the idea of the modern dream, or the switching on of the electric light, right? Therefore, it's not surprising if the unconscious appears in projected and symbolized form, as there's no other way in which it may be perceived. What does Edinger say about this? 129. Edinger says about this. I do have to say a word or two about the way Jung ends this section on soul. In paragraph 129, he says, soul is a principle of consciousness. Since the ego is the center of consciousness, that makes soul the ego. And he talks about the arcane substance and the longed for lapis. They were aware that with the sun symbol, they were already establishing an intimate connection between God and the ego. So this is projection, and I think we'll talk a little bit about transference afterwards. Like, there is psychological projection here, right? And therefore, the nature of this produces the sun symbol. Nature herself is expressed an identity of God and ego. In that case, only unconscious nature can be accused of blasphemy, but not the man who is its victim. And at the end of the section, he says, I must point out to the reader that these remarks on the significance of the ego might easily prompt him to charge me with grossly contradicting myself. I'll perhaps remember that he has come across some similar argument in my other writings. Only there is not a question of ego, but of the self. I have defined the self as the totality of consciousness and the unconscious psyche. So for Jung, the self is the greater egg. You split that egg to conscious and unconscious, right? So the self is parts of you that you are bigger than where your lens of focus are at any given time, right? So the ego is within the conscious, right? And then the unconscious can affect the ego through complexes, things like this. So in the essential part of the self can be used as a pars pro toto, part of the whole, when the significance of the consciousness is born in the mind. But when we want to lay emphasis on the psychic totality, it is better to use the term self. So for ego, the problem with ego is this: there's a conscious aspect of ego, for example, but there also can be an unconscious, informed aspect of the ego, right? And I think that kind of dynamic only gets exposed when you're starting to see things from what Jung calls as the whole of the self. It's a difference of standpoint. Now, this perspective shift, right? So the sun is the symbol of consciousness for both the ego and the self. So you can think of it as this: when we think of ourselves from the ego point of view, right? It's when we're in our body thinking of who we are, and we're projecting how we are to the world, right? Who we think we are. But when you think of the self view, imagine that's more like, I'm just going to throw this out there, like the near-death experience people, when they, you see your body from above, or when Buddhist practitioners sort of observe themselves in the world. So the idea, when you are observing yourself as an outside body, and suddenly you start to see, oh, I'm getting angry, right? As opposed to just experiencing the anger, something like this. I'm nervous, as opposed to, oh, he's nervous, something like this, right? So the reason the double representation of the self cannot come into conscious, effective existence except through the agency of an ego. Needless to say, it comes with plenty of effective existence with the ego. Now he's going to go into the ideas of Atman and Purusha. Atman and Purusha. Just move this here. Atman and Purusha and the nature of sulfur. So we go into that. He says, because of the singular role played in alchemy, sulfur deserves to be studied more closely. And it says, as a point of interest, we have already touched upon, is the relation to soul. It was called the prima materia of soul, soul being understood as gold, and as a matter of fact, sulfur sometimes identified with gold. Soul therefore derives from sulfur, and the close connection between them explains the view that sulfur was the companion of Luna. So when the god soul and the bride Luna are united, the coagulated sulfur, which is the corporeal gold, turns outwards. Extraversium, and is turned inward, introverted. This remark indicates the psychic double nature of sulfur, the sulfur duplex. There is a red and a white sulfur, the white being the active substance of the moon, the red that of the sun. And the specific virtue of sulfur is said to be the great greater in the red variety. But in duplicity, it also has another meaning. On the one hand, it is the prima materia, that is the form of the burning and corrosive, adurans, and hostile to the matter of stone. Altogether, sulfur is one of the innumerable synonyms for the prima materia. So then it says, in the sphere of Christian psychology, green has been a spermatic, a procreative quality, and for this reason, the colors attributed to the Holy Ghost as a creative principle. According to Dorn, he says, the male and universal seed, the first and most potent is the solar sulfur, and the first part and most potent part comes of all generation. It is the life spirit itself, the de tenebris contra naturam, Dorn says. We have said this before, that life of the world is the light of nature and the celestial sulfur. So the light of nature. Then he goes on to say, then it causes a significance. Sulfur blackens the sun and consumes it. Then it causes or signifies a putrefactio, which in our day was never seen, says the Rosarium. A third capacity, that is coagulating. So let's see what Edinger has to say about this. 38. So this alchemical, starting to talk about an alchemical active imagination. Jung mentions this dialogue starting in page 140, but he mentions it very briefly, and I thought it'd be interesting to hear a fuller version. Jung does call an active imagination, but what I'm calling it is the text comes from a treatise concerning sulfur in the Hermetic Museum. I'm going to read it to you with a few interpretive observations. In this account, an alchemist was obsessed with sulfur, and he had the idea that sulfur was an essential ingredient of the philosopher's stone. So this is sort of linking back to the nature of the philosopher's stone, right? And even in the inner fire of Mercurius, Jung says, sulfur obviously partakes in the most dangerous and the most evil nature, his violence being personified in the dragon and the lion, and is conspicuous in Hermes Kelenos. The dragon, whose nature of sulfur shares, often spoken of the dragon of Babel, or more accurately, the dragon's head, the caput draconis, as the most pernicious poison, a poison vapor breathed out of the flying dragon. The dragon's head comes with great swiftness from Babylon. However, the winged dragon, that stands for quicksilver, becomes a poison-breathing monster only after its union with the wingless dragon. So we've done a number of dragon podcasts too. Actually, I've collected those dragon podcasts in our esoteric dragon mysteries. We've got about 1, 2, 3. We did Alchemical Dragon and Tolkien and Martin, Tiamat of Dragons, Saturn and Dragons, Dragon in the Grail, Dragon in the Cross, Dragon the UFO, Dragon the Reptilian. You can go check this out in the bookstore link. But if we go back to, so this is, we're going to talk about the active imagination. And he says, Edinger here says, he's going to read from this essential ingredient of the philosopher's stone. One day on such a walk, all his thoughts were absorbed in the subject of sulfur. This is from the Hermetic Museum by A.E. Waite. And you remember the words of the sages who say that the substance is vile and common, and its treatment is easy. And he recollected the vast amount of time, labor, and money which he vainly spent upon it, about lengthy analysis. He lifted his voice in the bitterness of heart, cursed sulfur. Now sulfur was in the grove, and although alchemists did not know it, he suddenly heard a voice that said, "My friend, why do you curse sulfur? And master, I seek the philosopher's stone as the one that hungers after bread. And why do you come for sulfur? My lord sages has called it the substance of the stone." We curse our complexes, don't we? Edinger says. They don't go away. We work on them, and they're still there. The element of inflammability keeps setting the fire off again and again. And so now the sulfur is the chief of the stone, and you curse it unjustly, for it lies chained in the dark prison. Right? Here we go. It's chained in the dark prison. Tartarus. It's like Saturn chained in the dark prison, right? And cannot do as it would. Its hands and feet have been bound, and its doors of the dungeon closed behind it. It is at the bidding of the mother. So again, it's a chthonic force. It's below the unconscious. This is how Waite translates it. So we're looking at sort of techniques, of alchemical techniques that one gets to learn about the, let's say, the medicine, right? The medicine to release it. Jung points out sulfur is both a medicine and a medicus, the medicine and the physician. So the alchemist's dream is the medicine and the medicus, the doctor and the medicine. The double reference leads Jung to the theme of the wounded healer. So the wounded healer, right? You have your visions of Christ here. You have your visions of all this. But I want to go kind of, if we go into Jung's sort of use of the alchemical, I've got his version of his Black Book here. But Jung had this time when he was creating these Black Book journals that began back in 1913 even, so very early here. But I was listening to a podcast it was an interview by Jordan Peterson of Carl Ruck, who will talk about this classics professor. Carl Ruck wrote a book called The Road to Eleusis with Gordon Wasson about potential use of psychedelics in the Dionysian Eleusinian Mysteries. And I kind of in that podcast of Peterson interviewing Professor Ruck, Peterson asked him, he said, "Do you think that Jung did psychedelics?" And Ruck said, "Well, we never know for sure, but there was a time, and I think it's around the time of these journals, where it's sort of unaccounted for." And if you go through these Black Books become Jung's Red Book. These are the raw notebooks. But if you see these drawings, this is a mandala that he was drawing in 1917, and then some more advanced ones that these show up in the Red Book. You see some of these, right? And if you start putting so late in life, Jung is working on this Mysterium Conjunctionis, which is kind of like a survey of all the opposites, right? A survey of all the topologies, right? And we could go into Lacan on the topologies too later, maybe in a later version of this. But you start looking at, here's the commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower. Now, these are all paintings that Jung did. Well, they are very psychedelic, these paintings, right? Here's the Quaternio we talked about last lecture. Right now, this kind of looks like, is this the wounded healer? We have the serpent, the background, the interconnectedness, an eye of Horus perhaps in here, the eye meeting the person. It says, the legend reads, the man of matter rises up too far in the world of spirit. There the spirit bores through the heart with his golden ray. He falls with joy and disintegrates. The spirit who is of the evil one could not remain in the world of the spirit. The serpent, who was the evil one, could not remain in the world of the spirit. So you've got a serpent here, sort of very psychedelic looking drawing. Now the legend reads, the serpent fell dead into the earth, and there was an umbilical cord of a new birth. So there's sort of a connection between the chthonic serpent, the earth, this red color, very, very psychedelic. The image of the divine child, completion of a long path. This is where Philemon comes in. Now, if you guys know, Philemon was sort of a voice, let's call it an entity, machine elf maybe, who knows what it was, but it was a voice that Jung used to speak to when he did his meditation or his shadow work. He had a wise old man named Philemon, and Philemon is predicted here. It says, it means the completion of a long path. The image was finished in April. The work on the next image had already begun. The one who brought me the fee for Philemon had been predicted to me. I called him Phanes because he was the newly appearing god. So he had Phanes here. But this also is how he got his Philemon concept, sort of being born out of this image, is what he describes. Now we have another one. Now the dragon returns. So, we were talking about the dragon and the dragon of transformation, right? And a lot of these a lot of this dragon work, if we go back to the wingless dragon, it says, hence we get the parallel of the dragon's head with Christ, corresponding to the Gnostic view that the Son of the highest divinity took the form of the serpent in paradise in order to teach our first parents the faculty of discrimination. So he could see that the work of the demiurge was imperfect. So the son of the seven planets, the dragon, is clearly the Felis macrocosmi. As such, the parallel figure to Christ and at the same time his rival. The dragon's head contains the precious stone, which means the consciousness contains the symbolic image of the self. From this evidence of sulfur, the spirit of material forms the quicksilver, and it goes into the mercurius again. But again, it's sort of like the lapis unites the opposites, and this interpretation fully accords with the traditional significance of the dragon's head as a favorable omen. I think he's talking astrologically. So that was 141. Let's just see Edinger's notes here. 141. Edinger's notes. Skips it. Doesn't talk about the dragon. Odd. Very odd. But anyway, so here's the dragon image. We see here the accursed dragon has eaten the sun. His belly is cut open. His blood pours down. He turns the gold of the sun together with his blood. This is the turning back of the Atma Victu, of the old one, who has destroyed the proliferating green covering in the youth, who has helped me to kill Siegfried. So here's like you sort of Jung on his alchemical quest. This is the lapis philosophorum. Now we've got a carving he's done. This is Ka. He who was in the stone of his shadow, the Atma Victu. The legend reads, this is the castor of holy water. The Kalbiri grows out of the flowers in the blood of the dragon above the temple. You see these flowers, they look like poppies, something like that. And this one, right, above the land. The quaternary sun, shamanic Aquarian symbol with the jar. Wow, if that is not psychedelic, I don't know what is. Amor triumphant, he has the quaternity inside a quaternity. He's got a fourfold space with I could almost choose not to finish it. In the inexorable wheel of the four functions, the essence of all living beings imbued with sacrifice. So also this idea of like a psychedelic theme of like not being able to fully contain it, right? The Bhagavad Gita says for this comment, wherever there is a decline in the law and an increase of iniquity, I put forth myself for the rescue of the pious and for the destruction of the evildoers. For the establishment of the law, I am born in every age. This citation is from chapter 4, verse 7-8 of the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna is instructing Arjuna concerning the nature of truth. You can see the serpent's coiled. Perhaps it's Philemon or Jung himself. Another mandala. So I'm just showing you guys these because they're all very clearly in my mind, and as mentioned too in the that Peterson take, sort of have a psychedelic feeling. So to the question of this, I think maybe one thing that's interesting is not only were I think if you read some of the introduction to the Black Books or the Red Book, Jung kind of kept that work separate from his practice. And I think no story better kind of tells this blackballing of academics who want to go into that psychedelic route. And it's still probably somewhat taboo. I mean, there's some countries that have laxed some rules on some of the use of master plants, let's call it. And we know master plant tourism is huge. But my first introduction to some of these things was back in Boston University. Professor Carl Ruck, who was classics professor at the time. He had written a book. I'll show you a picture of Professor Ruck. Written a book on the Eleusinian Mysteries that was called The Road to Eleusis. And the concept of these books were... here's Professor Ruck. Professor Ruck. I took a number of classes with him. I think I actually left my footnote here. This is my bookstore receipt. What did I buy for his class? The Road to Eleusis. Wasson, Hoffman, Albert Hoffman also. Ruck. And then also there was a book called The Greeks and the Irrational with E.R. Dodds and Eliade. I think I had 3 classes with Professor Ruck. 2 of them, one of them was one where he spoke of the road to Eleusis, which we'll talk a little bit about in this one. The other one was a ancient Greek class, which was amazing. One of the stories, if you go out, you can go out and check out Ruck's story. There's a Rogan interview with, or you can even go to there's a interview with Brian Murarescu, who wrote The Immortality Key, The Secret History of the Religion with No Name. And actually it talks about him discovering Professor Ruck. And one thing that was interesting to me is Ruck, the 3rd class I took with Ruck, I actually audited the class. I didn't sign up for it. He did a film class. And I remember we would go to this class, we'd watch films, and he would sort of look at the films in the sense of almost like a Jungian or a Jungian journey or a psychedelic journey. So this is the first time I'm in university and hearing about psychedelics in a classroom, right? So it's very interesting. And the book talks about it. The Rogan interview with with Brian Murarescu is quite good, who he talks about Ruck. And then there's the Jordan Peterson interview with both Ruck and Murarescu. I think it's very interesting. So I was a student. The year was... It was in the late 80s, 1988, I think this one says. But as a student at that time, I had 3 great classics professors at that time. I had Carl Ruck, interesting. William Arrowsmith, the great translator of Greek dramas. I learned a lot about this. And then I had another professor, Rufus Fears, who was my Roman and Greek history professor. You can find his lectures out there. So Fears was more of your... he reminds me of the William S. Burroughs Edgar Rice Burroughs, not William S. Burroughs. The Edgar Rice Burroughs of the classics. He would come out and perform the great, the top 10 historical stories from Greek history. And he would come out and say like Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he would talk about the Punic Wars, and he would talk about Caesar coming to Rome. So he was a great performing professor. And I remember Arrowsmith was the poetic professor. He was the one who would, taught about you have to translate yourself back to what these plays meant at the time. The way the mythology was so rich. It's like mythology for the ancient Greeks was like us becoming fans of Netflix or our fandoms, right? But they were fandoms of Greek mythology, and they had worked in those dramas to sort of express themselves. And the 3rd class was Carl Ruck, and first of all, his ancient Greek class was great, and then his philosophical take, reading this idea that potentially psychedelics could have been used in the Eleusinian Mysteries. Thought it was fascinating, and also that he co-authored a book with the guys who invented LSD. I mean, it's very interesting, right? So Murarescu's book is quite good if you want to go into it. One of the things that I remember firsthand was that conflict between Ruck's style of teaching, which was very much against the orthodoxy of what a classicist was, because he was looking to unturn interesting new ideas, and the regime at the time. I think the professor was, the head of the Boston University at the time was John Silber. And actually, one of my roommates was actually working as a speechwriter for Silber. So I can remember like being on both sides of the crosshairs, sort of, where it was like, on the one hand, you had this conservative idea of what the classics department should be, like more Professor Fears, right? More guys from, I think Fears ended up in Texas or something like that. But great professor, awesome professor. And then I think on the other side, I was drawn to the Ruck Ruck kind of material. I mean, seeing Ruck talk about film was amazing. I mean, he would just open up these things. I remember my friend Eric and I would go there. We were both like metalheads at the time, you know, and Eric used to call him. It started with F and it rhymed with Ruck, right? He would call him. We're going off to see Professor F, you know, and because he would always kind of talk about Freudian themes, he would talk about Jungian themes. He was very amazing professor, and then looking back on that time to see how he was having a struggle at the time. You know, his book, The Road to Eleusis. I mean, I think BU called it like a vanity publication, but it's actually one of the most interesting books. And a book like The Immortality Key really goes through the importance of Ruck's work, of trying to search out, was there a psychotropic plant involved with these mysteries? And then what did those mysteries happen? So then you sort of see this parallel, I guess, between Jung's reluctance to bring his psychedelic experiences into the fold, and plus Jung's own complexes. You know, he has a heavily paranoiac in some ways of his Christian role in these, and he's got a lot of projection going on. But interestingly enough, he was such a genius, Jung, that he could set those aside and then move forward into that. So I recommend this by Brian Murarescu. He traces through the secret history of the religion with no name. You can learn a lot about Professor Ruck here. I've also got on the table here The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, for which Ruck did he wrote a afterword to. Maybe I'll just read a little bit from this. It says, this is called Fungus Reductivus, The New Light on the Mushroom Controversy by Carl A.P. Ruck. It says a story, toadstools. It was a story eventually acquired in the status of myth, the quest of Persephone for the narcotic flower that opened the vision of another world. I will draw an account of our mushroom quest. R. Gordon Wasson wrote in his final book, Persephone's Quest, which appeared just before his death in 1986. Valentina Pavlovna, my late Russian wife, and mine, in August 27, they were in a honeymoon in the Catskills. Suddenly I knew it. My bride threw down my hand roughly and ran up into the forest with cries of ecstasy. She had seen toadstools growing, many kinds of toadstools. She had not seen them since Russia, since 1917. She was in a delirium of excitement and began gathering them right there in her skirts. Gordon was aghast. These are toadstools, I said. They're poisonous. And I said, this is their first marital crisis. In 5 years of courtship, they've never discussed anything as fundamental as mushrooms. And here she was, possessed by the mushrooms. She insisted on incorporating them into dinner. I was beside myself. I acted like the perfect Anglo-Saxon oaf confronting a wood nymph. He would eat nothing with the mushrooms in it. Later, she claimed that she had predicted he would wake up the next day a widower, which would have fit of the myth, but he denied the allegation. So they're talking about just this ancient connection to the mycophilia and microphobia, fear of mushrooms and the love of mushrooms, and in this Russian mushroom history. And then he starts going into Christian heresies. Such were the Manichaeans with their special fondness for red mushrooms, a sect that St. Augustine had embraced for a time. So St. Augustine, in his book, so Ruck says in his book, The Apples of Apollo, Pagan and Christian Mysteries of the Eucharist, that the Manichaeans were fond of the red mushrooms. There's also the vision at the same time the dualistic Zoroastrian heresy, later persecuted as the religion of the Cathars in the Albigensian Crusade, began in 1209 under Pope Innocent III. The Wassons were already intrigued by the pagan Greco-Roman possibilities. And then we're talking about Amanita muscaria here, and then the psychoactive sacraments. So in this book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, John Allegro, this is kind of a strange book, super strange book, but his idea is that the Jesus story is actually a story of, it's not the cross, it's more like the mushroom is the Christ. And all of it is just a metaphor that goes back even into ancient history, and he does all of this crazy um, linguistic tracing to show this trail. I mean, very interesting and strange book. But yeah, some more things that people can dig into. I also brought this one out from Lacan's Transference book, because I think some of this idea that we talked about in Mysterium Conjunctionis about the dual nature of the Father and the Son, and then how that turns into the quaternio. I thought there was a kind of element of transference here, and also the kind of concept of the special Greek and Roman way of thinking about things. I think some of this is the things that, when you were in a kind of a Ruck class, a lot of this material would be surfaced, right? So I think what's hard for a lot of people when they're reading Mysterium Conjunctionis is the depth of these classical references. But I think one of the things that I learned from professors like Ruck, and then even the sort of narrative style of Fears, or the poetic style of Aerosmith, was that you could translate yourself into these texts. You just have to kind of find a guide, find a professor that works in it, or find a book about the book. Like I found Edinger for the Mysterium Conjunctionis. But just going into this a bit more, it says, so this is Lacan on his Transference, because I want to leave you with a reading assignment, De Natura Deorum, on the Nature of the Gods by Cicero. In this book, it did me a good deal of harm a long time ago. In order to get up to speed, you'll notice that Cicero is not the lout people try to depict him as by saying that the Romans were people simply dragging their feet. You'll see sorts of exceedingly funny things in it. For example, that in Cicero's time, people went to Athens to look for traces of the great pinups of Socrates' days. People went there saying to themselves, I'm going to meet a guy like Charmenides on every block. And you'll see that comparing the stir created by these to Brigitte Bardot, for example. So he's saying like people, even in Cicero's time, would go to Greece looking to run into these things. And I think very much so today, and you think of how people turn to Jung, right? I've talked a lot about Stephen Pauline work on Jung to Live By. Their work is talking about Jung is interesting, being a Jungian is interesting, but Jung was on his own trip, and you have to find the homeostasis for yourself, right? And so the idea also goes to something like Ruck. I think Ruck in his Peterson interview, Peterson was talking about, well, is there God? Is there something else beyond there? And I think one thing that Ruck said, he sort of learned that the deeper that you probe into what these mysteries are about, you learn it's about sort of like an art of dying. So you have to make the choice. Are you dying or are you living? And I think that part of returning to the body and the homeostasis of things means that a lot of the insights that one can gain from what would be sort of Jungian, let's say Jung's dabbling or exegesis of the alchemical corpus, let's call it, while it's useful, in the end, it should be used in service of your own journey and not an ends in itself. Because you see that even Jung, he kept his psychedelic writings sort of a bit obscure, and then he ends his career with just sort of almost like a gigantic encyclopedia of facts that you could use to learn things. And I think in many of the same ways, those connections that you find in Ruck are the same way in Murarescu's book sort of intimates those as well. So it says, he says, you'll see plenty of things in Nature Deorum as you'll learn the serious questions where the gods are situated. It says, why not then dwell on the scandalous objects that the gods of ancient mythology were? Without trying to reduce them to piles or files or to sets of themes, let's ask ourselves what it might have meant for the gods to act as they did, their most characteristic activities being theft, fraud, and adultery. I won't even mention impiety. That was their speciality. In other words, the scandalous nature of ancient mythology frankly raises the question of what a god's love is. It reaches its height at the outset of Homer's work. There is no way to behave more arbitrarily, unjustifiably, incoherently, or derisively than these gods do. Read the Iliad. They're always mixed up in men's affairs, intervening constantly. Yet we cannot think these stories were merely tall tales. I don't adopt the perspective, and no one can, not even the thickest No, they are there, and that's what they are. And what can it possibly mean that the gods show themselves to men in this manner? You have to see what happens when they take it into their hands to love a mortal woman, for example. Nothing will stop them until the mortal, out of desperation, turns into a laurel or a frog. Nothing is further from the trembling one feels in one's being when a love than a god's desire, or a goddess's desire for the matter. I don't see why I shouldn't include them as well. I took someone of Gurdjieff's stature and represent the dimensions and resonance of this prodigious myth of the Amphitryon. Even this great poet couldn't help but let Jupiter shine with something that might resemble a sort of respect for alchemy's feelings, but it was clear to order to make it plausible for us. But those who know how to hear, this myth remains the height of blasphemy. One might say, nevertheless, it was not at all how it is understood in antiquity. For here the things go without anything. Divine debauchery disguises itself as human virtue. I say this, nothing stops the Greek gods. I mean that they will go so far as to make a mockery even of what is best. That is the whole key to the matter. The best ones, the real gods, take impassivity to the very point that I mentioned earlier, namely to the point of being unable to put up with being called passive. To be loved is to necessarily enter into the scale of the desirable. Christian theologians were at great pains to rid themselves of it, for if a God is desirable, then he can be more or less desirable. This is how the whole scale of desire. And what do we desire in God if not what is desirable? So the gods of antiquity didn't beat around the bush. They knew they could reveal themselves to men only of the guise of something that would cause, and I love this translation here, only in the guise of something that would cause a ruckus, which is exactly what Carl Ruck did. Caused a ruckus in academia. In the amalga of something that breaks all the rules as a pure manifestation of the essence that remained completely hidden, whose enigma was entirely below the surface. Here the daimonic incarceration and scandalous exploits is, in this sense, I say Alcibiades was Socrates' daemon. One of the things that I wanted to sort of bring up from this was that notions of the shamanic notion of the, so again, returning back to the model here of, Edinger shows it, of God putting a piece of himself back into the world as a sort of alchemical transformation, right? So something descends into matter, right? The psychedelic moment descends into matter. And then you have a moment of the opening, the let there be light happens, right? And then you can either fly with it, with some kind of wings. You can just attune to the higher level, right? You can transcend. You can angelify. You can go off in angles. This is where a lot of your visual stuff happens, right? Visual stuff out on the wings, flying, this kind of hallucinatory side of things. The oneness of sort of like the, all is one, returning to the source. But then the third one is the chthonic version of that. That's, I want to call it the Saturnian one, and maybe it's the sulfur one as well, the eclipsing, the black sun one, which is the idea of you are incarnated with a sort of task, the art of living. So not the art of dying, it's like the art of living, right? So so a lot of that comes out of that, perhaps what, we don't know much of what the Eleusinian Mysteries were about, but we do know that some of it, if it has to do with the external teacher of the plant, then we can get some inference that way. So let's go back just to close things out to the last part. I wanted to sort of talk about 154. Okay, so here we go. Of the facade, finally, we have this. In the Tractus Mysterius, it is even called the Treasure of God. The references to sulfur as the arcane and transformative substance must suffice. So again, I also kind of go back to some of the other work in the field of the shaman being able to transform the water. Or think of it in the Dune Saga, the water of life, the spice. They take the water of life to transform. It's been turned into the Philosopher's Stone. I would like to stress Paracelsus's remark on the fourfold nature and the pupil Dorn about the four colors of symbols of totality. The psychic factor which appears in projection and all similarity characterize arcane substances is the unconscious self. On this account, again, the well-known Christ lapis, Jung talks about this in Psychology and Alchemy, parallel reappears again for the instance of the above-mentioned parable of the adept's adventure into the grove of Venus. As we saw, he fell asleep after having a long and instructive conversation with the voice of Saturn. In his dream, he beholds the figure of two men by the fountain in the grove, one of them sulfur, the other Sol. A quarrel arises. Sol, salt and sulfur. A quarrel arises, and Sol gives sulfur an incurable wound. Blood pours from it in the form of the whitest milk. As the adept sinks deeper into sleep, it changes into a river. Diana emerges from the grove and bathes in the miraculous water. A prince soul passes by, espies her, and they are inflamed for love of another, and she falls down in a swoon and sinks beneath the surface. The prince's retinue refuses to rescue her for fear of the perilous water, whereupon the prince plunges in and is dragged down by her to the depths. Immediately their souls appear above the water and explain to the adept that they will not go back into the body so polluted, and they're glad to be quit of them, and they remain afloat until the fog and clouds have disappeared. And at this point the adept returns to the former dream, and many of the alchemists find the corpse of Saturn by the fountain. Each of them take a piece and operates it but without success. We learn further that sulfur is not only the medicina, but the medicus, the wounded physician. Sulfur suffers the same fate as pierced by the lance of Mercurius. The body is symbolized as Christ, the second Adam, pierced by the lance of a mermaid or the Lilith or the Adam. The analogy shows that sulfur is the arcane substance set on par with Christ. We would turn away and discuss from such an absurdity were it not obvious that this analogy, sometimes in clear and conscious and veiled form, was thrust upon them by the unconscious, right? So hence there could be no greater disparity in between the holiest conception known to man's consciousness and sulfur with its evil-smelling compound. The common denominator of these two utterly incommensurable conceptions is the self, the image of the whole man, when reached its finest, most significant development in the ecce homo, and on the other hand, appears as the meanest, most contemptible, and most insignificant thing. It is at this concept of human totality the self is by definition greater than ego-conscious personality. And it is the privatio lucis that allows an autonomous existence. Lift up your heads, O you gates. Be ye lift up with everlasting doors. The King of glory shall come in. This is 145. Let's just check on 145. 145, let's just check what Edinger might say. Sulfur of the wounded, 144. Yeah, so he says, I think the context sulfur would represent the falls asleep and has a dream. The dream alchemist sees two men, sulfur and salt. Sulfur is both the medic and the medicus. Sulfur represents the fiery hot principle, and salt is the watery cold principle. Gabricus disappears in the womb of Bea. At certain development of sulfur, as desirous must be wounded, killed, or treated and bottled up. Jung describes this vividly in his vision seminars, where he talks about the transformation of anima and animus devils, which are synonymous with sulfur. Let me read this to you. In this transformation, it is essential to take objects away from those animus or anima devils. They only become concerned with objects when you allow yourself to be self-indulgent. The five desirousness and the element that is fought against in Brahmanism, in Buddhism, in Tantrism, and Manichaeism, and in Christianity. It is also important of psychology. When you indulge in desirousness, whether your desire turns toward heaven or hell, you give the animus. Edinger interjects. He means that if you desire something with positive effect, that would be turning toward heaven. And if you hate it, you're going to get even with it. That's turning toward hell. So this is what comes back to. And I think what Ruck might have been across as well. is that those plants were used as a way to, and the practitioners of giving the plant were the ones who were able to use their discernment to decide on how we're going to turn the story, right? So I think that one of the things that all of this points to is it's the intentionality, right? The intentionality. If you desire something with positive effect, that would turn toward heaven. If you hate it, you're going to get even with it. That's turning toward hell. You give the animus, so Edinger goes out, Jung comes back in. You give the animus or the animate object, it comes out of the world instead of staying inside its place. If you can say, yes, I desire it and I shall try to get it, but I do not have to get it. If I decide to renounce, I can renounce it. There is no chance for the animus or animus. Otherwise, you are governed by your desires and you are possessed. Right? So I just want to, while we're talking about the desires, I just want to kind of go back to this quote again, which was, So again, we're back to Lacan. So the gods of antiquity did not beat around the bush. They knew they could reveal themselves to men only in the guise of something that would cause a ruckus, in the aglamma of something that breaks all the rules, a pure manifestation of the essence that remained completely hidden, whose enigma was entirely below the surface. Hence the daimonic incarnation of their scandalous exploits. It is in this sense that I say Alcibiades was Socrates' daimon. Alcibiades provides the true representation. So we're talking a lot about the symposium here, right? So Plato's symposium. Alcibiades provides a true representation, unbeknownst to himself, of what is implied by Socrates' ascesis. He shows that the dialectic of love, as it was later elaborated in Christianity, is there. Believe me, it's not absent. Is not absent. For it is around the dialectic that a crisis developed in the 16th century, one that called into question the long synthesis, and I would add, the long equivocation concerning the nature of love that was sustained and developed through the Middle Ages, and an oh so positive Socratic perspective. I mean, for example, that the God of John the Scot is no different from Aristotle's God, insofar as he acts as eromenon. They cohere. They go through his beauty that God makes the world go round. What a gap there is between the perspective and the one that is opposed to it. But I am trying to express that is not really truly opposed. People opposed to it, to the perspective of agape, God loves us, insofar as it explicitly teaches us God loves us insofar as we are sinners, loves us as much for our evil doings as for our good deeds. This is in effect the meaning for our shift that took place in the history of the amorous sentiments, and curiously enough, in the precise moment at which Plato's message reappeared in its authentic texts. Divine agape, insofar as it is addressed in the sinner as such, is the core and crux of Luther's position. So again, we're seeing this sort of idea of the collapsing of, the reconciling of, I think Jung talks about the satanic urge and the Christian urge. There's sort of, again, I think discernment is a word that I like to use about it. But I think it's also holding it in suspension, not so much as blending it together, although we do talk a bit about this in the sort of visions of, back in the Dragon Mysteries. We do talk about this sort of childhood nightmare of Christ coming off the cross as a demon, and then also the idea of a winged sort of dragon figure being crucified, right? So this Christ of the dragon, just sort of a thought experiment. The dragon Christ, the Book of Hours, the second coming of the dragon within you, a dragon's egg as the sacred heart. So we kind of go into some of that concept, right? Just as a thought experiment, right? An alchemical experiment, let's call it. So back to Mysterium Conjunctionis, just the last part here. He says, if you have put your animus or anima in a bottle, you are free of possession, even though you may have a bad time inside, because when your devil has a bad time, you have a bad time. Of course, he will rumble around in your entrails, but after a while, you will see that it was right to bottle him up. You will slowly become quiet and change. You will discover that there is a stone growing in the bottle. Insofar as self-control or non-indulgence becomes a habit, is a stone. When the attitude becomes a fait accompli, the stone will be a diamond. right? And it says, and then Edinger says, with these wise words I'll end. I think that this is also intimated in Ruck's studies of the Eleusinian Mysteries, that something about what they were doing was the ability to change, for the shaman to change the waters of life, something like this, right? So the idea is you take the opposite and you sit with it. This is the practice, right? You sit with the opposites. And I think that's what the heart of Mysterium Conjunctionis is about. That's going to wrap up our podcast 66. Hope you like the Psychedelic Jung. We will talk to you all soon. Thanks for watching. Go check out the bookstore. We've got a Patreon. We've got the Cat 2 journals. We've got Alchemy and Anthroposophy and the Dune Saga out there. Artificial Psychoanalysis of Desiring Machines. And our podcast lecture series. If you want to see these in book form, I'll probably be collecting these as well. So it all helps to support us here. Thanks for your comments, likes, and subscribes. Trying to grow the channel. And we'll see you next time, and probably in 2 weeks. I'm going to continue Mysterium Conjunctionis. I'm on a project with the true crime nature of the Beatles and how that sort of intersects with, I want to say, mass applications of music. It's going to link in with Mysterium Conjunctionis. So we'll do our next lecture of Mysterious Conjunctionis with the Beatles slant. If that's interesting to you guys, we'll see you in the next lecture. We'll be continuing through the book about the personification of the opposites and moving more through the idea of music and the idea of sort of the collective unconscious. All right, guys. Thanks a lot for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.